This year will be in English. We will start going through some texts of the Zohar. Just a short introduction to what the Zohar is. So the Zohar is accepted to be the most central and holiest of Kabbalistic texts. The one who revealed the Zohar or brought us the Zohar was a Kabbalist by the name of Rabbi Moshe de Leon. Rabbi Moshe de Leon was a Kabbalist living in the second half of the 13th century, and Rabbi Moshe de Leon, when he gave out this text, he said that this is a Kabbalistic text that has been passed down for generations amongst Kabbalistic circles, and it dates back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is from the Tanaitische times, and many have doubted the authenticity of this text or the connection to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in that time. So, of course, researchers have been busy with this from many different angles, from an historical perspective, from a linguistic perspective, going through the words, what kind of words could Rabbi Moshe de Leon have known, what kind of words were useful for him, what could have been Tanaitic text. The general, most researchers agree on it that this text is not from the Tanaitische time, that it was not written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. There's even a very interesting story of a Kabbalist from those times, that his name was Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco. Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco, he was very fascinated, like all Kabbalistics from those times. I mean, Kabbalah, the mystical texts were existing before the Zohar itself came out, right? There were Kabbalistic circles in Spain or in Palestine. And Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco, from his name, you could see he comes from Akko, from Eretz Israel. And he decided to go to Spain, where Rabbi Moshe de Leon was living at the time. And he wanted to see the original manuscripts that he was using to determine whether this is an authentic Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai text. So Rabbi Moshe de Leon he promised him that he'll show him the manuscripts, and he died suddenly before he could show it to him. So Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco decided to continue his inquiry in trying to figure out what the origin of this text is. And we have a very interesting exchange between Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco and the wife of Rabbi Moshe de Leon. And this is what Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco writes. Ko yaseh li Elohim ve'ko yosif. Im ha'olam sefer zeh haya im ishi. So this is the words of Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco saying what the wife of Rabbi Moshe de Leon told him. Saying that this book was not a older text from my husband, but rather aval mirosho velibo midaato v'sichlo katav kol ma shekatav. From his mind, from his heart, from his head, and from his brain, he wrote everything that he wrote. And then he says, "Ve'omra lo beroti oto kotev miberadei davar lifanav." I asked my husband when I saw him writing text on his own, "Madua tomar she'ata matik misefer zeh?" Why are you saying that you are copying from an older book. ואתה, אין לך ספר, רק מראשך אתה כותב. You don't have an old book. You're just writing it down from your own head. הלא נאה לך לאמור, it would have been much nicer for you if you would have said, כי משכלך אתה כותב ויותר כבוד יהיה לך. You should say that you're writing it from your own mind, and you will have way more honor. People will honor you for it. ויען אלי ויאמר. And my husband said to me, answered me and said, אילו הודיע להם סודי זה, if I were to discover them this secret of mine, שמשכלי אני כותב, that I'm writing it from my own brain, לא ישגיחו בדבריי ולא ייתנו בעבורם פרוטה. Nobody will take my words seriously, and they will not pay even a cent for it. כי יאמרו, because they will say, כי מליבו הוא בודה אותם, that he's just making it all up. אבל עתה, but now, כאשר ישמעו שמתוך ספר הזוהר, אשר חיבר רשב"י ברוח הקודש אני מעתיקם, now that I'm saying, now that they will hear, that I'm copying it from the holy Zohar that was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai with Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh is like a divine inspiration. יקנו אותם בדמים יקרים כאשר עינייך רואות. People will buy it for lots of money, as you see. So this is basically the story of the research that Rabbi Yitzchok de Monaco is trying to make regarding this, the authenticity of this text, in the times of Rabbi Moshe de Leon, in the times that this book is coming to light, and according to the exchange that he has with the wife of Rabbi Moshe de Leon, it seems like he wrote it himself. Now, of course, researchers will take this text later and try to see if, I mean, we have other books of Rabbi Moshe de Leon. We know what words he used to write books, Kabbalistic books. So they will try to compare it and see, is it really something that he could have written all by himself? Was he copying from older texts that people had, other Kabbalistic people before him, maybe from the 11th century or from the 12th century, and he was just putting it together in one book? It's quite clear. I mean, some parts in the Zohar must be later because we have Amoraim names in it, which means Amoraim is the generations after the Tanaim, which means Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai could not have written this text unless we believe that he could see the future and then quote people from the future. But either way, the argument amongst researchers is still going on until today, whether or not this is a text that was written by Rabbi Moshe de Leon himself, or this is text that was a bit prior to him. But either way, it is clear that this is not a text that was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, according to the researchers. And despite the fact that the Zohar had much opposition throughout the years, it is nowadays the most accepted, like the canonized Kabbalistic text in general. And we have many commentaries to the Zohar. And we're going to read some text from the Zohar. We're going to see it is written in a way that it is connected to the Torah, right? It's divided by the Parshiot. Many of the texts are very boring. Many of the texts are very interesting. We have many stories in it sometimes. And it gives us a very different interpretation of how to understand the biblical text. And that is a very fascinating part about the Zohar and Kabbalistic texts in general, where you see like the Midrashim and the Talmudical text, they also have this tendency of not sticking to the words of the Bible exactly as it says and understanding it differently and comparing different verses from different places, but they do try to stick to a certain narrative within the biblical text. They could add how old people were, where they were before, where they were after, so they add things in it. The Zohar just sees all of it in a very different dimension, you could say, where all the texts get a different meaning, and the way they connect things is in a very interesting way. So we're going to start now with Parashat Naso. This is our weekly portion. We're going to read some text.
Sorry, Rabbi. So I came in a little bit late. When this exchange with De Leon? When did that happen roughly? What time? What's a rough date for that?
Talking about De Leon lived in the second half of the 13th century.
Okay.
But he passed away in the beginning of the 14th century. So this must be relatively close to his death time. Okay. So we're talking about the beginning of the 14th century. Now, the date when the Zohar really gets like canonized is more connected to the print age. That's in the 16th century, where the Zohar gets printed and then it gets distributed, and it gets fairly well accepted amongst all Kabbalistic circles and nowadays mystical and Hasidic circles.
Okay, and this is so people knew about it within Spain, and do we know at what point it became better known in other parts of the Jewish world, or was it sort of a fairly rapid spread, or is it hard to pin down?
So what we know for sure is that from the 16th century, we have this generally with many liturgical texts and even religious texts, that we have the 16th century is a turning point where things become a reality. They just become as is, because this is what exists. This is what people are buying. Not many people have, the means to print their own versions of it. So they're just buying whatever's being sold. The communities are buying what they're being sold. The scholars are buying what's being sold. And that becomes the version of the text that we have nowadays. So I'm going to put in our chat here a link to Sefaria. Now, unfortunately, this is only the Aramaic text and not the English translation or anything else to it. But this is what we have. And I have an English translation here. Does anybody else have an English translation of the Zohar? No.
Yeah, I have one.
You have one also. Okay, so maybe we can work with your translation and see what the differences are. Now, I have to warn you, Kabbalistic texts can be very boring. This is a learning in progress. We're going to take a look at a few texts. We have boring texts, we have interesting texts sometimes, interesting stories, but just to try to understand how the Kabbalistic mindset works and how these texts are and how these people think. So we're going to start with Parashat Naso. Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe limor naso et rosh bnei Gershon. So this we have fairly in the beginning of our parasha. Rabbi Abba Patach. Ashrei Adam lo yachshov Adonai lo avon ve'en berucho remiya. So we're now looking at this we have many times. Okay, so Hashem spoke to Moses saying, take the sum of the sons of Gershon, right? So we're counting the people, and Rabbi Abba opened the discussion saying, blessed is the man to whom Hashem imputes no iniquity, and in those spirit there is no guile. This I'm sure we could have different translations for it. This is a biblical text from Tehillim. Let's see if we could find a different translation to this. So we're looking at Psalm 32:2. Happy is the man in whom the Lord sees no evil, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. And then Rabbi Abba continues and says, right? Haikra lav reishei seifei velav seifei reishei. The beginning and the end of this verse do not agree. Why is that? Because the beginning of this verse says, happy is the man in whom the Lord sees no evil. And then the last part of the verse says, and in whose spirit there is no deceit or deceit. So it seems that the person has sin, but it is not ascribed to him. Right? And the end says, right, the person doesn't have sin. So what is this verse saying? Does the person have sin or does the person not have sin? And then he finishes, V'it le'istakla bei v'ha ukmuha. We should look into it, and it has been already established. And now it continues. Tachazi, come and see. This is something we have often in Kabbalistic text or in Zohar text. Come and see. B'sha'ata detzlota de mincha. People who speak Hebrew could very, very easily see that this is a very, very different text. This is an Aramaic text. We have, of course, many Hebrew words in it. Verses from the Bible will, of course, be Hebrew, but generally it's an Aramaic text. It's a quite complicated Aramaic text. Mincha, the time of Mincha, judgment dwells in the world. So Mincha time is a time, when is Mincha? Mincha is from after midday, half an hour after midday, until the sun goes down. That is a time of Mincha. So we're more referring to the time of sun going down, which is a time of dinim, right? In Kabbalistic texts, we have this very often, that the day is divided into different days where the spirits are different, where it's more merciful hours, more judgment hours, and we have this in the days of the week, we have this in the days of the month, we have this in the days of the year. So the time of Mincha is a time when judgment dwells in the world. V'Yitzchak tiken tzlota de Mincha. And Yitzchak, we're talking about Yitzchak Avinu, Isaac, he instituted Mincha, the prayer for Mincha. V'gvura ila'a shalta be'alma. Supernal Gvura rules the world until ad ate ve'a'el laila, until the sun goes down, until it becomes night. So dinim and gvura, dinim is judgment, gvura means like strength and power. So these things go together, right? You know, judgment is done with strength, is done with power. So when the time umizmana דשארי צלותא דמנחה, יתפרש שמאלה לקבלה ויתאר לילה. When the time of mincha begins, the left separates to receive the night, and the night is aroused. So we have like a separation within, we could say, the godly powers and the left separates to receive the night. And the night, that is a time of kingdom, of Malchut. Now, not everything that we have in the Zohar text is something that is relevant for us in any way. Many of the texts that we have in the Zohar are trying to explain how the powers of the world work. What times are good times to do things, what times are not good things to prevent things. But they're trying to, in a very mystical way, connect the powers of the spirits of the higher world to the things that we have here in our world. And the Zohar continues and says, Batar de'itar kol inon neture pitchin dil davar. After the night is aroused, all the guards of the external gates are aroused in the world and spread out. Kulhu mitarin be'alma ve'itpashatu, that we said. They spread out in the world. Ve'kol b'nei alma ta'amin tamad mota, and all the inhabitants of the world taste death. So after this, well, we're talking about, of course, sleeping. Sleeping is like a kind of death. And after the judgment is passed, then we all go into a sense of tasting of death. Veha itmar bepalgut lelia mamash. Itar smala demilkadmin. Uvarda kadisha salka rechin. V'hai tamar means and has been said that at exactly midnight, the left, right, in the Kabbalah we have right and left. Right is like the positive power, the merciful power, and left is more like the negative power of judgment and power and strength and all that. The left arouses as before, right? Like we had in Mincha times. That's when the Gvura comes. The holy lily exudes fragrances and raises a voice in praise. V'mishabachat varimat kala, and raises a voice in praise. Ucheden salka v'sharya reisha dele'ela b'smala u'smala mekabelei. Then her hand rises and dwells above, and the left receives her. So we have, during the hours of the day, we have different powers taking over. Who has the stronger hand now? Now, we had this in the beginning when we're talking about the right and the left. We have this in Shir HaShirim. Smolo tachat roshi v'yimino tchapkeni. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand hugs me. That we have in Shir HaShirim 2:6. So the left hand is the hand of judgment, and the right hand is the right of mercy. Keden karoza kare be'alma. This is then proclaimed in the world. Deha idan hu le'itara le'shabchalei le'malka. The time has come to rise from sleep and praise the king. Ukeden tushbechan mitarin ve'itbasuma dekola ishtikach. Praises then awaken, and everything is fragrant. Zakach ulakei man deitar lezavka zivugada. Praised is the lot of the one who awakens to affect this bond. This was translated here with this bond, zivugada. Do you have a different translation of the word zivugada? Because zivuga is more like a couple.
There's here to accomplish this coupling fittingly.
Coupling fitting, yeah. So this is something also very, very often that we have in Kabbalistic texts in general, and specifically in Zohar text, that we have this male and female connection within the mystical ideas. There's a masculine side, a feminine side. In many texts, you could see a very sexual connection within these different ideas. But the fact that it is mentioned here in a way of a coupling or a bonding thing, this is like the ultimate idea where we want to bring our actions to, where this is what we want to achieve. We want to achieve through our actions this mystical coupling of pairing up the masculine and feminine side of God to create this perfect image. When the morning approaches and the right awakens and hugs her, there is universal union, and everything becomes one. So this is like the cycle of our one day. We have the split in the evening, and then we have the death, and then we have the connection again in the morning.
Sorry, and so it sounds like the left and the power is associated with nighttime, and the right and the mercy and the feminine is associated with the daytime and the morning. In this sense, is that where the parallels are going here?
So with the right and the left, yes. In this text, we do not have the masculine and feminine here. We just have the general concept of pairing up. But that's right. The evening is more like the judgment side, and the morning is more of the merciful side.
Okay.
I see Ben.
Is Gvura not construed as masculine in this? It's not. It doesn't have a connotation of being masculine, just because of the root.
Generally does. Here we don't really have the masculine and the feminine part at all. And this is something we have often in these texts, that it's not clear cut who's in charge of what. So there are many attributes that could be masculine, that could be feminine.
So I don't know if this is if I'm making the right connection here, but I'm thinking about the Haggadah, the passage in the Haggadah where the students say, rabbis, it's time to wake up and say the Shema. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of a connection here, or there's some kind of a reference, or I don't know. Maybe it's just a maybe I'm going too far, but that's what comes to mind.
I think that's a very interesting connection, because during the night they were busy with telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's true. And then once it's time to read Shema, which is the morning, then we kind of transfer into a different phase in the day where a different service is required. And that is the Shema. I think that's a very good connection. Now we have the next part, Tachazi. Beshata devnei nasha demichin v'tamin ta'ama demota v'nishmeta salka le'ela kaima ba'atar de'kaima v'itpchinat al ovodaha ta'avdat kol yoma v'kavtin lehu al pitka. Come and see. This we have often. Come and see. During the time when people sleep and taste of death, the soul rises up and gets to stand in a certain place where it is examined about its daily activities, which are recorded in the book. Maitama, what is the reason for that? Begin the nishmeta salka le'ela va'ashidat ala vodai divnei adam ve'al kol mila u'mila denafik mipumei. Because the soul rises up and testifies about all the person's activities and every single word that came out from his lips. So the question was here, what is the reason for this? We don't really get an answer for what is the reason for this. It's just stated as a fact that every night we have a personal, I wouldn't say a trial, more of a testifying process, where we go up to heaven and testify about everything we have done, and everything that we say gets written down in a book. Vekad hahi mila da'apik barnash mipumei ihi kadka yaut mila kadisha doraita utzlota. When that word that exists from the mouth of a person is worthy, a holy word of Torah study and prayer, hahi mila salka uvaka rekiin vekaima ba'atar dekaima ad de'al lailia v'nishmeta salka v'achid lahu mila va'ilai kama malka. That word then rises and cleaves the firmaments. It stands there until nightfall, when the soul rises and grasps that word and brings it before the king. So we have here something very, of course, mystical regarding everything we say in general having a very strong meaning. I would say even more than a meaning, even more in the sense of an impact, an everlasting impact. So everything we say gets written down in a book, and if we have words of Torah study or prayer, then the words itself go up higher and it gets brought before the king. V'kad ha'himila lav I kad kayaot. V'iu mila mimilin bishin mileshana bisha. When the word is improper, one of evil words or of evil speech, that word rises wherever it rises to be recorded as a sin of that person. והוא חובה עלינו, חובה עלי. ההוא דכתיב, משוכבת חיקיך שמור פתחי פיך. This is the meaning of keep the doors of your mouth from her that lies in your bosom. This is a verse that we have in Micha. This is in Micha 7:5. I'm going to read a different translation of this. Put no faith in a friend. Do not let your hope be placed in a relation. Keep watch on the doors of your mouth against her who is resting on your breast. Now, what the commentary on the Zohar is saying, that meaning from the soul that gives testimony about his deeds. So we should be careful about what we say because our soul will record it. אשרי אדם אשר לא יחשוב אדוני לא אבן, אמתי כשאין ברכו ירמיה. So now we're going back to the beginning of the text that we read in the first part. Blessed is the man to whom Hashem imputes no iniquity. Namely, when the soul does not bear testimony against him, so that a certain sin will be recorded. When is that? When in whose spirit there is no guile. That is when he does not sin. So this is basically answering the question we had in the first part. So of course, this is about someone who does have sin, but blessed is the man that his soul basically doesn't testify against him.
So I'm not sure whether to interpret that as saying that the soul is like a separate entity, and because the soul is not guileful, the soul is innocent, the soul is like, I'm going to let him off on this one, or whether the idea is that the person is, whether this is sort of like the person is pure, their intentions are pure, so they sin, but their soul, they are innocent in their essence, even though their behavior was wrong, and therefore, so I don't know if this is about intentions trumping impact, or if it's about like the soul is almost like a separate entity, and we're hoping our soul is not guileful and will tattle on us.
I think it's a combination of both, because what the text says, when is the case that a person, their sins will not be counted? That is only when they do not have sin. That's what the text here is saying.
So, well, I mean, that's a third possibility, is that it's sort of like a riddle. It's like, when will your sins be not counted? Never. Like, it's sort of like Scarborough Fair, right? Tell her to, the song in which the guy is like, oh, I'll get back together with her when all these impossible things happen. Like she buys me an acre of land between the sand and the sea. Like, so it's like, that's one possibility, right? Is that it's like, well, if your sins won't be recorded if you're without sin, which can't happen, so they'll always be recorded. Another possibility is that it's sort of like the antinomian vibe that we were talking about in the earlier thing, where it's like, well, you may have transgressed some. I mean, it's sort of like what in the last thing in the Shavuot talk, where we were talking about sort of the Hasidic early things, where they were like, don't worry about the formalities. So it would be like, well, if you technically are sinning, but what's in your heart that counts, that's another possible interpretation, right? It's sort of like your heart is, your soul, your essence is without sin, even though maybe you did something, you didn't say the thing at the wrong time, or you drank a bunch of vodka on Yom Kippur, but it was for a good, right? Like there's that possible interpretation that the intention is what matters, I guess, or the idea that the soul is just, your soul is the innocent one. You might be screwing up, but your soul is too innocent to report on you. I don't know which of those three.
I think that first of all, like everything in Kabbalah, is that all options are possible, and it's also very interesting here because to try to answer the question, right? The first question was, if there's sin, then how could we talk about a person that doesn't have sin? And if there's no sin, then there's nothing to count about. There's nothing to and then he goes through this whole long explanation of the times of the day, and then the process in which the sins are recorded in heaven, which is through speech. And then towards the end, he just brings a verse saying, just keep your mouth shut. So basically, just train your soul not to tattle on you. And then towards the end, he says, no, but actually, the times when sins are not recorded is when there are no sins.
But Rabbi,
Yes.
perhaps you can understand it like if there were different qualities of sin. So if you sin just as a human being, you sin, yeah, but you don't do it with this real evil energy, yeah. And the other quality is if you sin and you really want to violate the law, and you know, perhaps it's in the background.
Hard to say. It's very hard to say because it's interesting that the text starts off with talking about sin. Avon is essentially sin. And then it goes through ve'en berucho remiyah, which connects to what you said, Klaus, that in his spirit, he doesn't mean evil. Right? And then when he divides it into the actual words that were used, meaning if it's positive words, if it's Torah words, if it's praying words, they get a special place in heaven. They come for the king. And if it's evil words, then they go wherever they go, which is a bad place. And then there is some in-between place to play around. So we could, of course, understand that way as well. The thing about the Zohar text and Kabbalistic text in general is that if we read these texts from a very traditional interpretation of it, then we just have the classic, what is divided and where, what means what. And usually among only ultra-Orthodox men over the age of 40, that they claim to know the only way to interpret it. But of course, if these texts are very, very shortly written and can be understood in many ways. And when we read the text from a very free way, we could understand it differently.
And it may have been understood differently too, because there's a sort of, that's what I took away from the Shavuot talk partly, is that the goalposts have been moved a lot, and so the like, just you were talking about the history of Hasidism, and sort of the anti-legalistic initial tendency has turned into a very legalistic tendency. So possibly, also the way it was written in Moshe de Leon's time, it meant some, could have been interpreted very differently. I had a historical question about that, but I don't want, not if it takes too much time, but I'm curious. You said that initially it was resisted, like the Zohar, that there were opponents, and because it is interesting that it's sort of like Judaism went for a long time being this sort of rigorously monotheistic tradition, in which was something, especially in the Europe, that where it vehemently distinguished itself from Christianity and all of the sort of fuzziness about maybe kind of God, like Jesus is maybe kind of God and maybe kind of not. And then it's interesting that at this era, and maybe that's true in earlier Jewish mysticism, but in that era of the Zohar, there's definitely this like celestial machinery of like parts of God that are differently ascendant. And I wonder if that was that part of the resistance against it. Was there a lot of pushback on like, well, now you're getting polytheistic again, or what, you know what I mean? Like, did that strike people as like, wait, now we have a multiple part God? Isn't that the other guys?
First of all, yes, that was also part of the resistance. But I think that the resistance was also internally and externally. Internally in the Kabbalistic circles and externally to the rest of the people, because there has always been circles of small groups of people that were busy with mysticism. And as long as they were doing their thing and everyone else doing their own thing, everyone was okay with it. It was when the mix-up started that people started to get edgy about it. I mean, and this is something very interesting. We have it with the Shabtai Tzvi movement. We have that in the 17th century. Shabtai Tzvi is very successful despite the fact that he's a Kabbalistic. He is followed because of his nationalistic views. And people are awaiting the Messiah, which they know in some way has to be mystical because they're waiting for it for so long. So it has to be something they're not expecting. And they say, well, maybe it's from those small circles of people that are busy with Kabbalah. And then when the Hasidim come around, like quite a while later, and there still is that link between mysticism, Kabbalah, and, well, fairly traditional Judaism, the fear rises again, and people say, wait a minute, last time we had a very bad experience with this mysticism. And the rest of the Jewish people, they were never busy with this text. So, of course, amongst the Kabbalistic people, it was canonized, like I said, with the print, and they had their beliefs, and it was even accepted as a holy text and something that people that do this, study this, they accept it. And the rest of the world, they didn't have to care about it.
So I hear what you're saying is before Shabbatai Tzvi, there wasn't like a mass resistance because it wasn't a mass movement. There wasn't a lot of, like, just because the Zohar was printed and passed around, it didn't attract a lot of pushback from the wider world until Shabbatai Tzvi made it a mass movement.
I think that the resistance was also, first of all, yes, but I think that some of the resistance is also regarding like the rewriting of history. And I can tell you this from my personal experience. When I discovered that, all the history of the Zohar, I grew up with the Zohar being with one author. And that's where the text came from. And it was passed down for 2,000 years. And when we went to Miron, to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we read this text, even though we're not supposed to because we're not 40 yet, we're not married. And then this is the holy text. This is the text that we got from him. And then when you find out, no, actually, historically speaking, it's probably not true. That raises the question regarding other Jewish holy texts, that if this became so canonized and this became accepted as if it comes from someone, even though we clearly have over 1,000-year gap in between, which nobody disputes. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, we're supposed to believe that this text was somehow passed down from rabbi to student for over 1,000 years and nobody changed anything, and it's exactly the same way. We have the same gap between the rabbinical text and Matan Torah, which is approximately the same, a bit more, but more or less the same amount of time. We have 1,000 years of a gap where the rabbis come around Second Temple time and say, well, we have this secret Torah that we're being passed down from rabbi to student, and the other Jews standing around, right? The Tzdukim, Betotim, Karaim, Shomronim, they're saying, nah, actually, no, we no. We're here from then, and we know that this text doesn't exist. So this is also part of the opposition, where people are saying, look, you can't claim that this text is coming from someone and nobody ever heard of it, and we don't believe it. We're not buying it.
Yep.
But this is the interesting story of the Zohar. We have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to start reading a bit more. I think maybe we should, if we're going to read it, maybe we should continue in the same way where we started. because these texts are often connected one to another, and it takes a while to go through them. So we'll see how much text we can still read now. Miben shloshim. So we're back to the biblical text now. This is a new chapter. מבין 30 שנה ומעלה ועד בין 50 שנה, כל הבא לעבוד עבודת הלווים ועבודת המסע באוהל מועד. This we have in the Bible. Every person from the age of 30 until the age of 50 that comes to work and carry the holy Mishkan. Of course, we're talking about the Levites, that this is their job. From 30 years and upwards to 50 years, everyone that came to do the service of the ministry and the service of carrying the tent of meeting, or the Mishkan. Pikuda da liot alviim mishorerim b'mikdash. This commandment is that the Levites should sing in the temple. Va'af al gav de okimna le'ela hacha tzarich lechadesh milim. Although this was already explained before, we need to add something new. Daha kohen ihu makriv korbana, v'iyu Michael, Levi ihu Gavriel, ihu tzarich lenagna. So here we have an interesting connection between the world here on our side and the world upstairs. For it is the priest who sacrifices the offering, and he is the angel Michael. The Levite is Gabriel, and he should play music. So this is also something we have common in Kabbalistic texts, right? We have this in rabbinical text often, right? In rabbinical text we have, well, the Torah told us 3 times that you should not cook a goat in its mother's milk. Why do we need it 3 times? So the rabbinical text has, this comes to teach us 3 different things. It teaches us you're not allowed to cook it, you're not allowed to eat it, and you're not allowed to enjoy it. Zohar, when they try to ask why we have something repeating itself in the Bible, they connect it to heavens. So the priest that sacrifices the offerings, he is the angel of Michael in heaven. And the Levite who sings while the priests sacrifice, they're Gavriel. So now we know what are the jobs of Michael and Gavriel in heaven. One of them is in charge of the sacrifices, and one of them in charge of singing. And that's, according to this interpretation, why the Bible in the first place has to tell us again, to connect it to us to heavenly beings. ורזה דמילה יום יצב אדוני חסדו, da chesed kahana rabba de Michael, iu kohen hediot ligabi marei. Vim kol da de hediot iu etzel marei, melech de chayot hakodesh iu, uverkat hediot alti kala benecha, vahai iu yom mitzav adonai chazdai. The secret of the words that we have also in Tehillim, yet Hashem will command his steadfast love, which is chesed, in the daytime, right? We said gvura, strength or power, is in the evening, but chesed, mercy, is during the day. Yomam yitzav Adonai chazdo. God will command chesed in the daytime. That is chesed, of which is the high priest. Right? In the priesthood, we have one high priest, who's called the Kohen Gadol in Hebrew. And then we have the simple priest, which is called, or the common priest, which is called Kohen Hediot. That's all the other priests that are serving in the temple. So, Chesed is the high priest. Mercy is the high priest. Michael, who we just declared him a few lines earlier as a priest, he's a simple priest. He's a common priest. And he's a common priest in relation to his master. Nevertheless, he is a common priest in relation to his master. He is a king over the holy living creatures. So we have, right, we say this in the Shabbos service. We say every day in the service, the concept of Chayot HaKodesh. Chayot HaKodesh, we were debating it when we were working at the translation of the Siddur. How do we translate Chayot HaKodesh? So Chayot HaKodesh could be holy animals or holy beings. There's a story about two Rebbes that met. I think it was the Rebbe of Gur and the Rebbe of Vishnitz. And the Hasidim of the Rebbe of Gur were acting like animals. They were pushing and shoving and just being animals. And the Rebbe of Vishnitz turned around and said, "Oh, these are chayas, these are animals." And the Rebbe of Gur, trying to protect his followers, said, "No, these are chayot hakodesh, these are holy animals." But holy animals, when we talk about chayot hakodesh, we talk about some angel type of being.
Where are Gur and Kishnetz?
Vishnitz. Gur is in Poland. And Vishnitz is...
I'm just wondering if it's a regional stereotype, because it sounds sort of like the Litvox and the... Anyway, if Kishnetz is in the north, then it could be sort of like a joke about, about the ethnic stereotypes of like the south being temperamental and, more Hasidic, and the north being more, I don't know, like uptight.
So I see one of our listeners is telling me that this is a story about Rav Shach and the Lev Simcha from Gur. So that is Hasidic and Litvish. Yeah.
Right. Sort of makes sense in that context, because what's being criticized is the rambunctious passion of the congregants, which is the Litvish didn't like, but he's saying that that's holy. Yeah,
the Litvish don't have this whole pushing tradition. They're more, held back, and they're more like the intellects and the study ones. Yeah, I'm just going to finish this this last part. Let not the blessing of a common priest be light in your eyes. That is what is meant by yet Hashem will command his chesed in the daytime. So here we have an interesting connection of we have a rabbinical text that says Al tia birkat hedyot kala be'enecha. A blessing of a simple person, you shouldn't take it lightly. You should take it seriously. If a simple person blesses you, it may have the power to help you. Don't disregard it. So what he's saying here is that when we're talking about an hedyot, a simple person, we're talking about a simple priest, not a simple person. And the simple priest, that you should not disregard their blessing because they're a priest. And now if the angel Michael is a simple priest, then essentially we're regarding his blessing as something that's worth taking into account. And that's what it means, the verse that we have in the beginning, Yomam Yitzaveh Adonai Chazdo, that during the day, God will command his mercy, his chesed, in the daytime. So we're now in Parashat Naso. We will continue next week in Parashat Naso, in the same place where we finished here. I'm going to stop the recording so we could